Major breaking news. Congratulations to the Second Amendment movement and to the gun owners of America and those people fighting for our rights down there in Washington, D.C. It turns out that the Senate Parliamentarian has signed off on zeroing out the tax on suppressors, short barrel rifles, and short barrel shotguns under the National Firearms Act. This is a great start. It's not enough, of course, in my view. And now that President Trump has just raised serious questions about the Senate Parliamentarian, appointed by none other than Nevada Democrat Harry Reid back in the day, we now need to reconsider whether or not Elizabeth McDonough, the parliamentarian, should be removed and replaced. Let's break all this down when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes. I'm a proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, we have a lot of breaking news here. Let me start with the very good news, which is this. As you may recall, the Senate Finance Committee wrote the big, beautiful bill, the one big, beautiful bill, and in it, they removed suppressors, short barrel rifles, and short barrel shotguns from the National Firearms Act. As well, in my view, they legally could. Because the National Firearms Act is 1,000% a tax. That is not the view of Mark Smith or the Four Boxes Diner. That is the view of none other than the United States Supreme Court on multiple occasions, including back in 1937 with the Sunzinski case, and in 2012 with none other than Chief Justice John Roberts literally writing that the National Firearms Act is a tax in the context of upholding Obamacare in the National Federation of Independent Businesses against Sebelius. Now, despite that, unfortunately, this so-called Senate parliamentarian, who is not a U.S. senator, is not an elected official, has never been an elected official, said that the removal of these three items from the National Firearms Act was not allowed under the so-called Byrd Rule. Now, just to jog your memory, the way this is going out right now is this. As you know, to pass legislation in the United States, the House of Representatives must pass it, and then the United States Senate must pass it, and then once it's passed, it's signed by the United States President, and it goes into law. That's the general rule. However, when you're dealing with substantive legal changes, legislation, the general rule is that it has to be or can be subject to a filibuster in the United States Senate. A filibuster is basically an opportunity or an excuse to continue the debate forever until at least 66 senators vote to close the debate, known as cloture. However, there is a narrow exception to the filibuster in the United States Senate under the Senate rules, and that is what's known as the process of reconciliation. Now, reconciliation is a very, very narrowly defined process dealing with simply and purely budget items, dollars and cents. Specifically, a reconciliation process is a way that a statute can be passed without dealing with a Senate filibuster, because it just deals with money. And the general rule with the reconciliation is this: that to the extent it deals specifically with taxes or raising or lowering revenues by the federal government and or dealing with what's known as mandatory spending, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and the like, as long as it deals specifically with the dollars and cents and spending and taxing authority of the federal government, the process of reconciliation is allowed for Congress to enact law with the signature of the president and bypass the possibility of that legislation being filibustered in the U.S. Senate. But it's narrowly defined. Now, historically, the person that dictates whether or not a proposal or a proposed piece of the legislation through the reconciliation process, the person that decides whether or not a proposed law or amendment or statute, whatever you want to call it, as part of the reconciliation process, the person that kind of decides, is it in bounds or out of bounds? Is it a strike or a ball, if you will? Is it part of the reconciliation process or not, legally or otherwise? Is the Senate parliamentarian. Now, this is a pretty important job, but it's usually pretty straightforward. Does the issue involve taxes or mandatory spending? Yes or no? That's the question. Well, it turns out that after the bill that would have removed suppressor short barrel rifles and short barrel shotguns was submitted to the Parliamentarian to see whether or not this fell within the process of reconciliation or violated the so-called Byrd rule, B-Y-R-D. And the Byrd rule is just the rule that says that you're not allowed to slide in to the process of reconciliation substantive legal changes to statutes that would otherwise be subject to the filibuster. It's basically a way to make sure that people don't game the reconciliation process to put in major substantive legal changes that would otherwise be subject to the filibuster. Now, because removing suppressors and short barrel rifles and shotguns from the NFA is clearly tax related, because the NFA only exists under Congress's taxing authority. Everyone understands that, including the U.S. Supreme Court in multiple cases. To mess or change the National Firearms Act, or even to remove it, is clearly part of the taxing authority of the federal government. And as such, it clearly falls within the process of reconciliation. This is a no-brainer. There should not be any debate on this. Nevertheless, Elizabeth McDonough, the parliamentarian appointed by Harry Reid, with the boast that she's the first female, the first woman parliamentarian in American history, Elizabeth McDonough came out and said that outright removal of these items from the National Firearms Act, suppressor, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, violated the Byrd rule because it blended taxation issues with pure regulatory issues. Now, this, as I've covered before, is 100% legally wrong. Now, with that said, I'm going to tell you what happened, the good news, and then we're going to break down on whether or not we should fire Elizabeth McDonough. The good news is this. After she ruled that you could not remove these items from the National Firearms Act, the Republicans went back and tried to at least get a half loaf of the bread, if you will. So what they did is they modified the removal of these three items from the National Firearms Act, and they simply zeroed out the tax. And they said that you can acquire a suppressor, but you won't have to pay that $200 tax. You can acquire short barrel rifle, short barrel shotgun, but you won't have to pay a $200 tax on those items. They submitted that again to the parliamentarian, and she signed off on it and approved it, and said that fine, that is okay. That does not violate the Byrd rule because it doesn't deal with regulation. So that is great news that that part of the process has been at least approved. But the question is that enough? And the answer really is no. Legally, it's wrong. Legally, she's wrong to say that these items cannot be removed from the National Firearms Act. So I went back and took a look at her credentials to try to understand how could she make such a terrible decision on the merits. I know she's a Harry Reid appointee, the late Democratic senator from Nevada. Obviously terrible. I know they bragged about how she's the first female, first woman parliamentarian in U.S. history, and why, that's awesome, great. Okay. By the way, did you know that Ketanji Brown Jackson is the first U.S. Supreme Court justice to ever appear on Broadway? Just a side note. Anyway, the point is that Elizabeth McDonough, who was raised in Maryland, graduated from the university, from George Washington University. She did an internship, not a clerkship, but an internship, which just means an unpaid assistant to a district court judge there in D.C. Then she went to the university. Then she went to Vermont Law School, not University of Vermont, Vermont Law School, and after that became an immigration attorney at the Department of Justice. She was a civil servant in DOJ, work on immigration issues. And then she went to work for the parliamentarian office in Washington, D.C., and in 2012 got elevated to this huge job. So there's nothing about her background, in my view, that would sort of suggest that she is sort of some sort of intellectual giant or someone that would understand the nuances of these detailed laws. But nevertheless, she's been doing this job as parliamentarian, for some time now. She hasn't been fired. As to why the Republicans didn't fire her, I don't know. But they haven't. So with that said, my position was, at least yesterday morning, was basically we should not try to fire Elizabeth McDonough because it wasn't going to happen. And we should not be rocking the boat until we get sign off by the parliamentarian that we could at least reduce the taxes to zero on these items pursuant to the NFA. But now some things have changed. Most importantly, President Donald Trump has now come out and raised serious questions about why are the Republicans in the U.S. Senate following the Parliamentarian. Here's what President Trump had to say. The great Congressman Greg Duped is 100% correct. An unelected Senate staffer parliamentarian should not be allowed to hurt the Republicans' bill. Wants many fantastic things out. No DJT. That's what President Trump wrote. Now, what exactly did Greg Duped say that caused Donald Trump to say, yeah, there's a problem here. We need to reassess this as a parliamentarian. Here's what he had to say on X. How is it that an unelected swamp bureaucrat who was appointed by Harry Reid over a decade ago gets to decide what can and cannot go in President Trump's one big, beautiful bill? The Senate parliamentarian is not elected. She is not accountable to the American people. Yet she holds veto power over legislation supported by millions of voters. Well, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. And again, prior to Donald Trump coming out and raising this issue himself, because they're not going to do anything as significant as replace the parliamentarian or fire her without the blessing of President Donald Trump. Because if you get rid of her, there's a possibility that some of this process could be slowed down, and that would not be consistent with what President Trump would like to see happen, which is to have the one big, beautiful bill signed into law on July 4th, a few days from now. But with President Trump now raising issues about Elizabeth McDonough, I think that does open the door to discussions. Moreover, my concern was, there's an old saying that I used to talk to my clients about, and it goes like this, and this speaks to this issue. I always told my clients when they were debating whether or not we would accept the settlement, for example, or try the case, one or the other. I would often say to them, look, never forget this. Pigs get fat. Pigs get fat, but hogs get slaughtered. And I think that's very good advice in many instances in life, that you want to make money, you want to get ahead, you want to get your stuff, you want to get the bill through, you want to succeed 100%. But be sensitive about not asking for so much that you get nothing. You get slaughtered. Pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. A good lesson for life, a good lesson for business and settling legal cases. And I thought applicable here is the last thing we wanted to do was to jeopardize, in my opinion, the ability to have the parliamentarian sign off on the reduction of the NFA tax on these three items down to zero. We would not want that. It is better to have them zeroed out to zero down to zero on one big, beautiful bill than to get no change whatsoever to the NFA for many reasons. So the question is, should we fire Elizabeth McDonough? Well, there's a lot of politics associated with that, so I can't really give you the perfect answer here because there's a lot of things that go on with this legislation. The old saying, it's like making a sausage. You don't want to know how it's made. There's a lot going on in Washington, D.C. that I'm not privy to. I'm not in Washington, D.C. I'm not talking to elected officials. I don't do any of that stuff. So, I don't really know the dynamic. So I'm kind of weighing in on this a little bit as an outsider. Because again, I'm not in the room where these decisions are being made. So with that caveat, though, it is a legitimate question that perhaps Elizabeth McDonough should be fired on the grounds of alleged gross incompetence. Now, the reason why I say that is not because of her modest legal credentials, in my opinion. It's because of her decision on this NFA thing. Because I don't see how she can reach the conclusion that the National Firearms Act's taxing components can be removed under the reconciliation process as it's tax-related. But you can't remove these items of suppressors, short-barrel rifles, short-barrel shotguns from the NFA entirely on the grounds that the registration, the fingerprinting rules, and all this stuff is allowed to stay. The reason why I say this is it's very well understood, and you look at the Supreme Court cases of both Sebelius and Szynski, and just understand how this process works, that the only reason why the NFA registration, the NFA fingerprinting, and all this stuff exists, the only legal basis for this to exist under our constitutional scheme of government is that Congress could use this Article 1 power to tax. Once you're no longer taxing these items using Article 1 power of the Congress in the U.S. Constitution, there is no legal or constitutional basis for these regulations and fingerprinting requirements under the NFA to stand, because there's no legal hook for them to stand. The only reason why these things are constitutional is because the registration and fingerprinting requirement is designed to support, it's derived from, it's there to ensure compliance with the taxes. It's to say that this suppressor with this serial number has the $200 tax stamp. How do we know that? We look at the registration list to see that the tax stamp on this item with this person has been paid. That is the only reason why the registration exists, is to ensure that the tax on that item with that person has been paid. Once you remove the obligation of the tax being paid on that item, there is not only is there no purpose of the registration requirement anymore, there's also no constitutional hook for the registration requirement to even exist under the Constitution, because there is no Article 1, and just to jog your memory, Article 1 in the U.S. Constitution gives Congress its powers. Article 2 gives the president his powers. Article 3 of the Constitution gives the courts their powers. So we're talking about, does Congress have an Article 1 authority to have a registration list and fingerprinting requirements of all these items under the NFA if you take away the taxing component? The answer is no, because these things only exist to supplement the taxing power of the Congress. If you don't have a tax on these items, there's no longer a legal hook, because there is no basis under Article 1 to have a firearms registration, any of these things. And by the way, for those of you out there that are super nerds, don't come back at me and say, well, Mark, maybe we could use the Interstate Commerce Clause. Well, first of all, no one's ever made that argument. So you could not use Article 1 powers under the Commerce Clause to do that in the first instance. And number two, given the multiple precedents such as the Lopez case in 1995 that knocked out the original version of the gun-free zone, gun-free school zone law, right? Interstate commerce, the Commerce Clause, is not a basis for some sort of registration or other regulation of firearms. That's not a hook based on Supreme Court precedent. But again, none of that should matter here, because again, the entire argument for all of the stuff under the NFA is the taxing authority. So for them to sort of shift gears and argue this is justified under the Commerce Clause would be a brand new argument that was never made for the last 8 decades. So I don't think that's going to fly. I don't think that will fly with this Department of Justice that would arguably be defending the law, if they will. I don't know, sure they will, but if they would, I'm not sure they will. But if they did, I'm not sure they make that argument, because it's a pretty weak one. And then even if they made the argument, you'd have to have courts accept the argument. And I think that would be a stretch, which goes back to the point that the only way this registration requirement under the NFA can stand, in my view, without the tax component attached to it, is it can't. It's got to go bye-bye. So with that all said, the fact that what I just said here, that Elizabeth McDonough doesn't understand that this whole thing is part of the tax scheme, and because it's part of the tax scheme of the federal government, it's 100%, in my view, subject to the reconciliation process and can be pulled out of the NFA entirely with these 3 items under a reconciliation process. And yet somehow Elizabeth McDonough, as I understand it, said, well, the tax you could take off it, but you can't take off the registration regulation, because there's a regulation that would violate the Byrd rule. But this just goes to show, to me, extremely sloppy reasoning, which would be consistent with what appears to be, in my opinion, the very modest career credentials of this parliamentarian. So I'm not surprised that someone might get this wrong, but I'm sure you, as a viewer of the Four Boxes Diner, would not get this wrong. And here I think is another example of, I suspect almost all my Four Boxes Diner viewers would know more about how this works than the Parliamentarian of the United States Senate. So should she be fired? This is a political question. There's a lot of moving parts to this. I feel like this is above my pay grade, so I'm not making an official recommendation. So anyway, there you have it, folks. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at Four Boxes Diner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.